pension reform, governance, operations, benefits, investments, transparency, models for reform, et cetera, is what you're going to hear until 3:15. And we've got three presenters. Again, Chuck Reed, former mayor of San Jose, is going to be up here for this. Richard Costigan, you've heard for before, and then Olympia Nguyen from CalPERS. Thanks.
We already heard a little bit about the San Jose pension reform, so I'm not going to talk about that, except if people have additional questions. We talk more state and more national. I'm chairman of the board of the Retirement Security Initiative. As I mentioned earlier, we're bipartisan advocacy for fair and sustainable pensions. My board and staff and I have worked probably vast majority, if not all, of the significant state-level pension reform in the last 10 years around the country. And we operate with some principles for pension reform that have played out in quite a few states. So most people agree retirement should be safe and secure, right? Don't really need to argue about that one. Benefits and costs should be fair, sustainable, and predictable. Not too much to argue about that. Benefits should be funded as they're earned. Incentive to underfund commitments should be eliminated. Everybody agrees with that, but nobody's willing to do it. It's kind of the problem, because benefits are not funded as they're earned. But anyway, that's a principle. An underfunded liability should be paid down. Management should be open, transparent, and non-political, and no single solution will work everywhere. Those are the principles that we work on and have been currently in about a dozen states. Now, I show you this slide not because I think you can read it, but you can see the colors. So the red is what states are paying for OPEB, interest payments, and pension out of their own sourced revenues as of 2014. This is a slide put together by Alicia Manel out of the Boston College Center for Retirement Research. What it really is a 6% stress test. So the gray is what states are going to have to pay on top of what they're already paying if we live in a 6% world instead of a 7 or 7.5, or in some cases 8 or 8.5% world. It's kind of a stress test. As you see, California is in the middle. There's a little bit of yellow there for California. So we're not the worst. We're not the best. We're just the biggest. And in some case, a lot bigger than others on some issues. If you look across the country at dozens of pension reform efforts, and there have been dozens, local and state, there are some common characteristics that I think are applicable, if not universally close to it. First is leadership. That's leadership from the top. This is something that's really hard to lead from the bottom. Leadership from the top. You saw in PEPRA reforms in California. Why'd that happen? Governor Brown, he made it happen. That's pure and simple. Leadership at the top. San Jose, the mayor had to take the lead. San Diego, the mayor took the lead. Or in some states, the legislature leads. In Michigan, the House and the Senate, the Assembly and the Senate there, told the governor they weren't taking up his budget bill unless he was willing to deal with pension reform. Well, they got things moving, and Michigan did reforms. So it could come from the legislature. Usually it has to be a legislative leader, not a junior member of a junior committee, but legislative leadership. There's usually lots of negotiations. Sometimes it's within the party, be they mostly Republicans that are doing this. Sometimes it's within the Democrat Party. Sometimes it's between houses of the legislature. Sometimes it's between the legislature and the governor. And sometimes it's with public employee unions. Lots of negotiations because these are, as you know, complicated and difficult. There's almost always opposition. Not universally, but usually the public employee unions are opposed for lots of reasons, but there's going to be opposition. This is never easy. In almost all cases, there's litigation, even when the unions agree to a deal. In Chicago, Rahm Emanuel cut a deal with 12 unions, maybe it was 13, a lot of unions, for his pension reform effort. It got litigated and overturned in the courts because these are individual rights that belong to individuals, and others that aren't in the room when the deal is made have grounds to complain and almost always will. This is an iterative process because it's difficult, it's big, the problems continue to grow, and we're seeing in cities and states that had to do pension reform or have done pension reform, they're coming back because the problem isn't solved with the kinds of things that we've been doing. And it's lengthy. It takes years, typically. Maybe years of negotiation, maybe years of bills, but usually years. The problem is years in the making, and the solution is also years in the making. But we've had a pretty good year for pension reform advocates. We've had good successes around the country. My organization has been involved in most of them. I mentioned Michigan. They have a new set of retirement choices for state teachers, and they've capped the growth of liabilities. Pennsylvania, new hires are going to choose between two hybrids or a defined contribution plan with a substantial risk reduction for the state. That was a 4.5-year effort. South Carolina, they amended their funding policies related to the assumed rate of return, the schedule for amortizing pension debt, amount of annual contributions to actually increase contributions and improve the funding. That was phase one. Phase two is benefit modifications, which are taking up in the next legislative section. Arizona is the more interesting and unusual case around the country because in Arizona we had statewide union leadership that came to the conclusion that their plan was doomed and they needed to do something about it. And so they engaged with the legislature in the process, lots and lots of negotiations, but ultimately a public safety retirement bill passed last year, signed by the governor, and was put in front of the voters with a ballot measure and approved. Now they have a constitutional prohibition in Arizona of doing anything that affects pension benefits. So basically they opened up their constitutional prevention and drove this particular bill through, and they closed it again. Now we have done the same thing with the correctional officer retirement plan, covering all state and local correction, detention, and probation officers. Now both of those reforms replaced a broken permanent benefit increase mechanism, sometimes called a COLA, with an actual COLA tied to inflation. Both reforms provide new employees with a choice between a fully funded defined benefit plan or a professionally managed defined contribution plan. All provide better retirement security for their employees while minimizing the financial risk to the taxpayers with 50-50 cost sharing. In Florida, we have a new employee choice plan, and we're defaulting new employees into the defined contribution plan. They can choose a defined benefit plan if they want, but the default is a defined contribution. Kentucky adopted a 5.25% assumed rate of return. They are going to have a special session this month or next to deal with a benefit package and changes. And then that brings us to California, where nothing important has happened. But something important is about to happen. As you heard this morning, the California Supreme Court is considering pension reform cases. The Marin County case is on hold, waiting for Contra Costa and Alameda, but the CalPERS case is in a briefing process. And for my purposes, recruiting amicus parties, lawyers, and funders, our amicus briefs are probably due November 22nd. So you'll probably get a hearing date next year, probably get a decision next year. And I say probably because it's the California Supreme Court. Nobody gets to tell them what to do. But we will have something in California, either an affirmation of the current system or a change to the system. One way or the other, it will be of great significance. And what can you do in the meantime in California? As I mentioned, the independent plans, maybe they can go to their voters. The rest of the plans are in CalPERS or CalSTRS. Negotiate with your employees to pay more. That's pretty much it until we get different rules out of the California Supreme Court. Now, negotiating with your employees to pay more is not easy, but it is real money. And many cities have done that. It is politically possible and feasible in some jurisdictions. And in many cases, that's about all you can do. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rich, who is going to talk about CalPERS again?
Yes.
Okay, I wonder why.
It's exciting. Just one quick question on the question you had about attracting millennials. The other board I sit on, the State Personnel Board, when I went on the board in 2007, we had almost 8,000 classifications. We've actually tried to reduce that to under 4,000 to try to onboard people a little bit quicker. The biggest problem we had seen wasn't actually the DBs or DCs. It was actually, if you're not familiar with the rank of 3, how to actually get hired into state service. And so that's been the barrier. It takes us 3 to 6 months to get somebody onboarded. And so we're working through that. So any changes that you guys could offer would be great on that. I'm going to talk a little bit different on transparency and reforms. Kind of tell you a little about what CalPERS has done. I don't want to rehash the history, but as you know, the CalPERS of 1999 and 2000 is not the CalPERS of today. If you don't know or hadn't recalled, a couple years ago we had a former board member commit suicide right before he was to be sentenced. We have a former CEO in jail. When I came on the board in 2007, we had just had the release of the STEPTO report, and this is a little bit of different set of reforms than what the mayor was talking about. If you don't recall the STEPTO report, basically there had been some type of super secret board meeting on the shores of Lake Tahoe, where Mr. Villalobos, who had been the board member at that time, was given a contract somewhere around $1 million in order to get the PBM contract on behalf of a company called Medco. So when I first rolled into the board, and again, as Mr. Crane, I don't think David's still here, but and Mr. Pellissier know, I worked for Governor Schwarzenegger, and I was the chief of staff to the Republican leader in the state assembly. So I have a pension. So this was not something I hadn't seen. I got it. So I've been working on pension reform for over 20-something years. In fact, I was the chief of staff to the original committee chair of the pension committee in 1996 when there was actually an attempt at a constitutional amendment to change DBs and DCs. So I've actually been seated at this table for a number of years, and I was in the Schwarzenegger administration in 2005. So Dan and I and David have lived all the reforms, but what I want to tell you about is what CalPERS has done today and where we are. One of our hallmarks on reforms is transparency. If you didn't know, as Ed knows, all of our committee hearings are public. All of our stuff is webcast. Our meetings are archived. You can find and learn anything you want about us. Actually, one of my frustrations at times with CalPERS is we have to do almost everything in public, with the exception of some investment strategies, because as you can imagine, if we're going to dictate, as we were talking about on hedge funds a little while ago, if we're going to tell folks, we'll move markets. So there's a few things that and employment issues, but oftentimes, as you've seen on tobacco divestment, oil divestment, all of this takes place in the public. And so transparency for our board is extremely important. I know this is not the same as the reforms that you were talking about, but I want to talk about some of the reforms the board has been doing. Private equity fees. I chose the wrong line of business. I should have gone into the 2 and 20 world. We have really spent a lot of time dealing with private equity managers. As you know, again, we got rid of our hedge fund managers. We're reducing the number of private equity managers that we have. Our goal, and this is what we never lose sight of, and I may have been a little stronger in my earlier comments. Look, we recognize it's your money. We know that. I mean, that's one of the things that we do is that everywhere that we can cut fees, anywhere that we can save, anywhere we can get better investment returns, right? At the end of the day, it's the employer, the taxpayers' dollars that we are the stewards of. So when we look at reforms, when we look at transparency, when we look at cutting private equity fees, we cut fees by almost $100 million last year. We have a new system up. If you want to know what we're paying managers, information is available to you. Some of the problems we're running into, old managers, old vintages, don't want us to give us information. I think, Ed, you've written about this. New managers coming into the system, we get the fee information. Those that are kind of in between, new, have old vintages and asking for new money, Mr. Iliopoulos and Wiley Tolet, our number 2, we're demanding fee transparency. On the budget, and again, we're accessible. If you're not getting information, let us know. Our budget, we have tried to make it more transparent as possible. In fact, over the last number of years, we've received a number of awards from municipalities for just the amount of information that we're providing. It's your information. We're trying to make it available. On actuarials, on what Scott is doing, we're putting the information out there. I know sometimes it's difficult to read because there is so much information. I know we've worked with Mr. Nation to try to get the data to you. Joe and I have been working since I first got on the board to make sure that this organization was getting the data in a proper format. When you look at investments, for example, one of the big changes from the late 1990s, early 2000s, I don't get to pick an investment. I hear that we used to pick out the trees that went into shopping centers. Right now, we delegate anywhere between $2 and $6 billion for staff to spend. After that, they do come for board approval. We don't meet with private equity managers. We don't go out and look at shopping centers, right? Things have changed. This is part of our governance model. We delegate. At the end of the day, it is the board. All of our delegations are online. Anything that you want to see that we've delegated to staff, you can read about, and if you have questions, you bring them to us. Let us know. I mean, we try not to micromanage a little bit as the board. This is the most difficult as being one of the 13 trustees. Where's the line between micromanaging and managing an organization? In the past, our board members got too involved. And I think sort of the comment about the actuaries was the history of CalPERS, that was the issue. You dictated to investment staff, you dictated to actuarial staff. That's not the case today. And I think a lot of it are these governance reforms. The system went through a lot. When you look at sort of the legislature, oftentimes that we struggle, as I was talking to some of the folks from San Jose today, we had one of your local members wants to talk to us about divestment. At the end of the day, we're responsible as the fiduciaries to the fund. But we're constantly, actually, I may leave early. Apparently, we're having a really interesting conversation today at Investment Committee about divestment out of Trump properties. And so we're constantly dealing with the legislature on how do you manage the portfolio. You may have seen last month, we divested out of coal. Legislature tells us in SB 185, it is time to leave coal. And what happens? Coal's skyrocketing right now. This is what we have to deal with when you talk about reforms and divestments and investments and what the board struggles with. We have not only 3,000 employers and 1.8 million beneficiaries telling us what to do. We have folks wanting to run initiatives, and then we have 120 bosses at the legislature, and then we have the governor, who I do give, again, a lot of credit to Governor Brown. He drove pension reform. Some of the other issues that we've done on reform is we've tried to change what's compensable comp, what's included in it. As you know, at one point, I think under PEPA reform, there were 120 classifications. We worked through that. I know on Loyalton, one of the difficulties, and this is what my committee is really tried to focus on, and again, we have 2 up tomorrow. We have Trinity in Nyland Water District. We tried to put a process in place. If you've defaulted or you seek terminated agency, we're trying to expedite it. It is not on those that have quit paying. It's difficult because we run into 2 things. If we're slow in being able to process an action, it is your money. It is the taxpayers' money. As fiduciaries of the fund, the longer that system goes on. The same thing with trying to get folks terminated out on a voluntary basis and us assuming all liabilities. It's not, we're the stewards of the fund. Just a couple other things on reform that we've done. If you want to know where we travel to, how much we spend, all of that is now online. It's all about transparency and sunshine. The collections process is online. You can find all of this. So just, I know it's not the same reforms that the mayor was talking about. I'm happy to talk about some of that. Again, we want to be the truth sayers. SB 400, one of the issues was, did staff get it right or wrong? I would tell you to go back and read the analysis and then look at what the board did. Today, I think some folks were saying, well, why doesn't CalPERS get involved in pursuing certain legislation? Well, that's what all of you wanted with SB 400. Now you look back and say we didn't like it, but you liked it at that time. Today's flavor might not be the one you like 10 years from now. What we've really tried to do with Scott and others is if you bring information to us, if you ask the question, we try to provide the data to you and then let the policymakers take that information. In fact, tomorrow on our agenda, we have a member of the legislature who's asking us to look at the issue of COLAs. Now, as a policy, the question is whether or not COLAs can be suspended. That's a separate question to be had. The real question is, what is the cost of that? And where does it fit inside the unfunded liability? And that's really what the board has tried to do. If you don't know, our new CEO, Marcy Frost, came out of the Washington system, where she'd been for about 30 years. Teddy Leopoulos and Wiley Tillett, both investment specialists. Scott, who went to Michigan, boo. We have just fantastic folks. A CFO, again, a reform that we did, how we didn't have a CFO. We have a risk manager. And then on top of that, the board does have outside independent consultants. The board itself has 3 consultants, infrastructure, private equity, and overall pension consultant. And then we have an outside fiduciary counsel. So we get a lot of information. A lot of this was the change from the early 2000s. So again, I'll be happy to take any questions, but just a little different amount of reform. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll be discussing the general types of pension reform. So Mayor Reed and Richard have already gone over some of these, but I'll talk about these in a more general term and also list some specific reforms under each category that might help address either mitigate risk or address this pension issue. We understand that implementing reform is not straightforward, but perhaps using a combination of these reforms might help, might be a solution. So we know that increasing the discount rate or betting on the market are not solutions, but perhaps one of these or a combination of these would be. So the first type of reform is general budget reform, and that addresses program fees or raising taxes. Plan type reform would restructure the plan, and we've talked about this briefly, into a hybrid where employers and employees would be sharing the risk. Benefit reductions all depends on what happens with the California rule, and I'll talk about that very briefly. And then the fourth one pertains to the asset portfolio. And I think here, with a stronger focus on risk management, in addition to understanding valuations in the market, would help support portfolio performance and also mitigate risk. The fifth one is obvious, increase efficiencies in operations. And then I'll also touch briefly on increasing transparency, which Richard already went over. So general budget reform, as I mentioned, is about raising taxes or increasing program fees. And I'll walk through an example of where we did this analysis for the city of Los Angeles. And we looked at pension costs over the past 10 years. So as you can see, pension costs grew 8% between 2006 and 2016. At the same time, the budgetary department's share of the general fund expenditures decreased from 56% to 48%. We looked further into the budgetary department sector and saw that there were specific areas that were being crowded out or squeezed out, and that was city clerk, controller, the soft services that Joe was talking about. But raising taxes or increasing program fees is not that easy. And in one example, in the Kentfield School District in Marin, voters defeated a ballot to raise a parcel tax, to levy a parcel tax to fund local government services and programs. So there's a limit as to how much taxpayers are willing to pay. In terms of plan type reform, as I mentioned, it could be a hybrid system. So as we know, the pension plans are defined benefit plans where employers are contractually obligated to pay retirement benefits. We all know that. But what about a hybrid system between a defined contribution, which is like a 401k, and a defined benefit? So retirement benefits are based on a retirement benefit formula, which is based on salary, a multiplier, and years of service. So perhaps in a hybrid system, you could adjust this multiplier. Also, employer contributions could be lower, but with a matching contribution, and employee contributions could be increased. In terms of benefit reductions, again, this all depends on what happens to the California rule, because this applies to vested benefits. But again, back to the formula that I talked about, perhaps changing the benefit formula or the final average salary, which is a factor in the formula, could be changed. So investments reform, or reform to the investment strategy or to the portfolio. This is a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart because of my experience in the area. But I want to talk about our initial analysis on the San Jose police and fire portfolio. If you look at the two pie charts, that's the asset allocation of the portfolio from 2006 to 2016. The orange slice grew from 5% to 45%, almost half in 2016, and that's alternative investments. That can be a risky asset, and I say can because it depends on the asset and the time when you allocate it to that asset type. But that includes private equity, private debt. I included a lot of things in there, including hedge funds and commodities. But again, this is kind of an aggregate overall picture of how the portfolio has changed in terms of its risk profile from 2006 to 2016. Also during that time, the dark blue slice has fallen, and that's equities, as well as the gray slice of the chart, which is fixed income. But that brings me to the next chart, which is the bar chart here. It's also the San Jose Police and Fire Plan, and this is the management fees from 2006 to 2016. They grew from, and the pink line is other expenses, and then the red chart, the red bar is the investment management fees that are incurred by third-party asset managers. That third-party asset managers charge the pension plan. And they grew from 9 million to 22 million over this time period. And that's a faster, 5 times the growth rate of the portfolio growth rate, which grew from 2.3 to 3 billion. Yes, it's just a growth of about 10 million, but what I want to point out here is that most of these management fees were charged by the alternative assets class. But that said, I don't want to imply that we should just unwind asset classes or investments that have high management fees. You know, I believe that it all depends on understanding the risk of these asset classes. So that brings me to my third point in investments, which is that a strong understanding of the risk of the asset classes is very important. So understanding the duration between the assets and matching them between the assets and the liabilities, and understanding the market risk, the sensitivity of the asset prices to the changes in the market is very important. Also, it's not just about unwinding given the cost, but also about the valuations in the market. So currently, equities are extreme levels, and so are bonds. However, depending on whether bonds go lower or higher, is going to tell you whether you're going to want to de-risk in fixed income or not, for example. Also, I think that to further the understanding of risk management, and also to minimize costs of management fees, you might want to add in-house investment management staff. But I'm cognizant of that cost as well, and I think Sean Bill had mentioned that earlier. But I think maybe adding to a certain extent, depending on your needs in the pension plan, adding to a certain extent experienced in-house staff might benefit. But that brings me to the next point, that operations and governance can be improved, and we talked about that earlier, but shrinking the size of the workforce or invoking a hiring freeze, and then at the same time contracting out work to workers who do not have retirement benefits. We saw in our analysis of the city of LA that there has been more salary reductions, what they called one-time salary reductions, which they seem to be doing every year to help this pension issue. And then finally, transparency. I know Richard touched upon this, but also I think transparency from third-party asset managers in terms of their disclosures and costs would help. So that's it on my side.
All right, so we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Questions on governance at all? Yes, sir, over here. Wait for the microphone, please.
My question is for Richard. My question's for Richard. One thing that really worries me is when, just historically, is when people who work for government talk about transparency, I start getting scared, because usually that means that something's being hidden. But with that being said, I'm wondering, we're talking about all these safeguards that have been made to protect the public from bad investments. And one investment which comes to mind very clearly is the $1 billion hit plus that CalPERS took with an investment in land source. I think it was in 2009. It was on the Mayor Island project where they gave a loan and then the loan was defaulted within a year and CalPERS lost over $1 billion. My question is, would the new rules and regulations that you're putting into effect prevent something like this from happening?
Well, I'm not familiar with the mayor. That was before my time, but I will tell you sort of one side story. That's some of the changes we've made. Prior to my coming to the board, PERS used to have a policy where we'd be 100% inside of an asset. We've since changed that so that we're no more than 25% of an asset. If you go back and look, particularly in our private equity, there were some areas where it'd be 100% of the fund. We're no longer the case on that. And so the example that you're using, and you're absolutely right, in real estate, this goes back to the professionalization of the staff. And as you know, we actually have a lot of, this is what I'm actually missing right now at PERS. We're having a discussion about contracting out on private equity, as you may have seen at our July offsite board meeting, versus how do we deal with staff, how do we compensate staff in the same context of the private sector. But when we go back and look at investments, you go back, that's one of the other changes. Board's no longer involved in those decisions. You're required to have the due diligence. You're required, does it fit within our asset allocations? Does it fit within our risk? Does it fit within our investment? And then where are our outside consultants as well? So is it perfect? No. In fact, as we see with Ed and Adam, we expect you guys to continue to ask these questions. I'll just respectfully disagree on the transparency. We want to get the information out there to you. And the more that you're saying you're not getting it from us, the more Wayne and others want to hear. Okay.
I was just using it as a...
No, I understand.
But, when you lose over $1 billion, that's a lot of money. And I didn't see CalPERS really trying very hard to get the money back either in any way.
Well, I happy to follow up. I don't know that familiar one, but if you actually look at it, and I know some representatives from Stockton may not be happy, but we were aggressive in making sure that we were paid in Stockton. What we've been doing both on terminated agencies, both voluntary and involuntary, we've pursued litigation. I mean, you look at what we do today, and yes, we're in fact trying to do it. 2009, I would say, is a whole different CalPERS, well before.
Okay. Yes, over here.
Earlier, Sean talked about Ontario teachers,
Crown Fund.
and it's held up as a paragon in terms of management. Has a very different pay structure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess their compensation is market-based. They do direct investing alongside private equity firms. Is that model simply a non-starter in the United States because of political pressure?
We're very familiar with the Crown Funds and their structure. Look, their governance structure, their civil service rules, there's a lot of differences. And in fact, we look to the Ontario Teachers Fund, and we get a lot of staff from Ontario and from the Canadian Fund, and they are great models. I mean, when you look at what our folks make vis-a-vis the private sector, I mean, and this is just on the public side, our CIO that manages a $330 billion fund was paid less than $800,000. Your UC coach at Cal makes 4 times that, right? I mean, you look at these structures as to how, and then when we talk about raising salaries, and again, you always have to keep in the back of your mind, it's not our money, it's our members' money. And as we start to bring stuff more in-house, we're going to see this dual pressure to both increase salaries and then figure out, should we in fact run our own either private equity or investment fund? And we're trying to do that more by bringing more in-house. I mean, love Ontario, it's just a different structure. It's a Crown Fund, is a sovereign fund, similar to the Dubai Fund or the Dutch funds. We're just not set up that way. So, but we do look at it, and they're one of the folks that we constantly talk to on governance modeling. But we're having this conversation. This is where you all have an important role. If you think that CalPERS should in fact set up a subsidiary to do its own investing, come to our board meetings. Those are the type of discussions we're having. In July at our offsite, We had 3 of the large funds there to talk about this very issue. Should we, in fact, create an investment arm for PERS?
Okay, there was a question here, yeah.
Not wishing to put Richard too much on the spot, so feel free to duck this question. But CalPERS, I represented Stockton, and I represented Vallejo, and been involved in a number of these issues with CalPERS. And CalPERS took a very aggressive legal stance, not just with respect to compromising but specifically in a variety of cases, and not just Stockton and Vallejo, went way out of its way to take a really extreme interpretation of what vesting meant, and actively engaged on that definition. Many of us felt it was very inappropriate for CalPERS to do that CalPERS's role is, as you say, to administer people's money, and not to advocate, especially when we're not talking about compromising money in the bank, we're talking about prospective benefits. Do you know what the position of the board is at this point, and is it at least committed to taking essentially a neutral stance with respect to these legal issues?
I would say, in general, should a local government either pursue bankruptcy or termination, that we will continue to follow the policies we have as we did with Stockton and Vallejo. That's probably not the answer you want, but we will continue. Look, I will say, we can agree or disagree on the outcome in Stockton. Courts ruled with us. I mean, from the standpoint that the final decision was in PERS' favor. And I know in the dicta on Stockton, there were some questions on, he's got a follow-up question. I know Dan's ready to go too. If I had known this was going to be just more CalPERS, I would have brought my general counsel and others, that this forum was supposed to be a little broader than us.
I understand. The issue isn't Stockton, because Stockton took the position
San Bernardino?
Compromise. It wouldn't compromise the pension, and that was the position that we took in throughout. So it's not there's no concern in my mind about that. The question is really more specifically with respect to prospective benefits and whether CalPERS is going to take a position that essentially is adverse to these Court of Appeal decisions that have come down.
Since we're in litigation right now, I'm not going to comment on it, but I will tell you this is sort of the point I made on SB 400 about what you want out of CalPERS is the information. You don't want advocating positions because, again, the position in 1999 is what everybody wanted. Today's position, and that's one of the things that both Ann Stossball and Marcy Frost have been working on, is we want to get the information out to you and to the policymakers. The question is, would we advocate, and we were supporters when you look at PEPRA and pension reform, we showed all the data that 25, 30 years out, the impact it would have. Those are the type of questions, as I've told League and CSAC and others, those are the type of questions to ask, because what you want is, Scott and his folks have the information. You need to get the information out there. The question of whether or not we would defend, advocate, not defend, or not advocate for some forward-looking policy change, the position the board has been trying to take, and I'll just speak for myself, and I would oppose us taking any positions on that, is that's the policymaker's decision. Give you the information. I mean, one of the biggest issues, as you've seen, we've had prescription drugs come before us, we've had the divestment bills come in front of us, and we always default back to what is our statutory and constitutional authority, how far do we get out there? I think we clearly got way out there on 400. I mean, you go back and read the analysis and you look what the board put out and you go, how did they even arrive at that on it? That's the difficulty today. And just one last point, sort of like on the tobacco divestment, comes back in front of us, we get it on both sides. I voted not to reinvest in tobacco, but not because it was tobacco. If you go back and watch the questions I asked of one of the experts, it's a heavily regulated, heavily taxed asset that at some point becomes just not an asset to wait. As long as we always default back to the legal rationale, and I think what you'd see going forward is we are advocates of a defined benefit plan. We are advocates of retirement security, right? That's what this board is for. The question then is up to the policymakers to have all that information going forward.
Let me go on this side first,
Let's
yes.
see who's asking this question.
Okay.
Yeah, hi, John Fensterwald from EdSource. And I know Richard CalPERS, I was just curious about on CalSTRS for potential reform, what it might take looking ahead to changes in perhaps by the Supreme Court for local control to come to school districts, so that school districts could have more of a say over the kinds of benefits that their pension programs had. I don't know if would statutorily, constitutional, I know the politics of dealing with the CTA would be difficult, but if anyone has a
I
thought.
just one comment on school districts, as people know, this is what's always the way. Teachers are in STRS, but their classified employees are inside of CalPERS. So we have the janitors and the bus drivers and the cafeteria. I mean, it's an odd system for a school district because you actually have two sets of employees in two different systems that are getting different type of actuarials and all. So it's going to be interesting to see. I spoke at a trustee roundtable last week at CII, and one of the Marin County folks were there. And what's interesting is you talk to them, they never envisioned all of this when they were pursuing it. They were just looking at how did PEPA reform sort of impact it. And it's kind of mushroom because the question you now look at is, on a prospective side, it's A plus B plus C. Because one of the questions is, if a financial change in circumstances can create a reasonable benefit, what if financial circumstances get better? You know, because as you probably know, there's a Michigan case out of the Northern District of Michigan from 2007, I think, or 6, that was very similar to this, a financial change in circumstances related to, I mean, no precedent for California, but when you look at where Marin County will go, and then just very quickly on the CAL FIRE case, on the airtime, the employee buys all the airtime. I bought airtime. You pay the employer, and the rate of return, and I know people talk about it. A lot of that burden rests back on the employee when they purchase the credit on it. It'll be interesting to see, because again, one of the CAL FIRE issues, if you were employed prior to PEPA reform, are you entitled to all of those benefits once you vest? So there are a lot of questions that the courts need to be answering.
So John, real quickly, did you want to jump in, Chuck?
I was just going to say, no matter what the California Supreme Court does, it's still a statutory scheme for CalSTRS. Now, they might empower the legislature to change the statutory scheme, but in any event, it's got to go back to the legislature.
And John, I was just going to say, there is supposed to be someone from CalSTRS here. Is there a CalSTRS rep here? We had him on the list, so not. Okay, sorry.
Transparency side, because you guys have in the last 10 years made it a lot easier to not only know what's going on at CalPERS, but also to anticipate the future. When you guys started putting in long-term projections on rates, it became much easier to prove to reluctant folks that costs were going up, and it wasn't speculation, but actually there were estimates, and that has been very important. It allows us all to know that CalPERS costs are going to go up about 50% in the next 6 years. And instead of it being folks like Joe saying, I'm really worried about this and this is where the numbers are going, it's like you got it in black and white on the valuations. So that's really important. But the other thing was, you mischaracterized what happened in Stockton. You guys did not prevail. You guys got your clock cleaned when the judge said you can change the benefits in bankruptcy.
That was in the dicta. It wasn't in the holding.
Richard,
All right,
you guys
Dan.
got your clock cleaned in Stockton. The judge,
So you can tell Dan and I have gone after this, gone back and forth like this for a few years. Yeah.
the judge then said, we're not going to unwind the whole deal, but the tool to change benefits of members was in the box. He didn't make them use it, but he made it very clear that the tool was in the box. CalPERS had asserted repeatedly and vehemently that you couldn't. So you lost big.
Okay. Other questions or comments?
I have a question for Olympia. So when I look at the asset allocation in your pension reform observations, what I find interesting is the Stanford endowment actually looks quite similar. It has 26% in equities. It has about 8% in fixed income, 6 or 8%, 8% in real estate, and the rest is alternatives. Clearly, a pension fund is different than an endowment, but they're both striving to capitalize on returns in a very unique capital markets environment. How would you address those two differences?
Well, I think it depends on their investment strategies and what their targets are for annual returns. Here, you're in the San Jose police and fire case, you're managing a pension and trying to match, I think, the assets versus the liabilities, which are I think, very different from the Stanford endowment. Additionally, I'm not advocating that you should change your asset allocation. I'm just pointing out that perhaps the increase in the management fees, which eat away at your returns, might be coming from that bigger orange slice in 2016. So again, I'm not also saying unwind all the assets, but in that slice, but I'm just saying that, that might be something that you could explore on a more granular basis, looking on a hedge fund basis, on a manager basis. But I think it also merits to look at the risk of each hedge fund, and also to understand those strategies and whether they match or they contribute to your overall investment strategy. Also, the reason I'm showing the asset allocation chart is because I want to stress that not just market risk for each individual asset type is important to look at, but also a total approach, looking at correlation between the different asset types, and also looking at VaR absolute risk might be something to consider. But I don't think that comparing the I don't know much about the Stanford endowment. I'm just focusing here on the pension, public pensions. But I would think that their investment strategies and their goals, objectives are different.
Okay, other questions? Anyone else? Can I do a lightning round really quickly?
You're the boss.
First of the day, lightning round. So, really quickly, I'll just go down the row here. If you could pick 2 reforms or 2 things that could enable reforms, what would you pick? What are the top 2 things on your list? I mean, I think I know one of yours, but
First, we want the California Supreme Court to say that future benefits and future contracts for future work is negotiable just like pay. And then the second is I would like to eliminate the conflicts of interest in the system where the majority of people making decisions have an incentive to overpromise and underfund. And I'm not just talking about the trustees, I'm talking about the entire system.
Actually, my reforms would be on the other side of the house, really looking at healthcare.
sorry, say again.
Healthcare.
Healthcare?
Because we haven't even gotten to the other side of our house. In case you didn't know, we're the second largest purchaser of healthcare after the federal government. And so when you look at some of the reforms, which our staff is actually working through, is really focused in the health area on both delivery, wellness, silver sneakers, things of that nature.
So what specifically on healthcare, or is it?
No, it's both the delivery and having long-term, one of the issues that's going to come up is, while you look at the pension side of the house as being a vested right, one of the questions is whether or not healthcare is the vested right, and how much of healthcare is the vested right, and what is the employer-employee compact on healthcare. And that's really, when you're starting to look at it, that's really where our long-term risk and liabilities are. I'm not as concerned on the pension side of the house as I am on the healthcare side of the house, because costs in healthcare seem to be going up at a much more rapid rate than they are on the pension side.
Okay, so Richard just said he's in favor of Medicare for all, or no?
And one of
I'm
the
joking.
issues is
I'm joking.
No.
I had to.
No.
I know you well enough to suggest that. I know that's not.
When you look at it, it's not, because the problem is, for our employees, it may not be as good as a product.
Right. I understand. Olympia?
I would probably eliminate conflicts of interest, because I think looking at both the asset and liability side is important, and there needs to be communication there. And then also contract out more work.
The problem with the Contracting Act, just very quickly, is under 19130 for the state, it's very difficult to contract out when you actually have classifications of state employees. So we have investment classes, and it's difficult to contract out, and you can't use pension costs as a basis for contracting out under 19130. In case you didn't know, in case more than you probably want to know about state contracting.
All right. Thank you.